Hi and welcome back to the course. So in the last video we had a look at some magic here where we would be able to insert things into the database simply by calling database.insert. And obviously Python already tells us that it does not know what database is. It says unresolved reference database. So we have to create this database. Notice that Python doesn't say that this is invalid. It's simply not been created yet. So what we'll do is we're going to go not into our models, but outside of our models and create a new Python file called database. And in here, we're going to create a class database that is also coming from object. Now, let me take a wee second to explain what this is. Basically, what we're doing here is we're saying this class database that I'm creating, remember that class is a definition of a type of thing in the real world. So this class database essentially is an object, and I'm defining some extra properties and extra actions that a database can do on top of what an object could do. So objects in Python, the real kind of object, this thing here, essentially what everything in Python can do. All of the things in Python are objects. And objects can't do very much. There are a number of things that they can do, and they have a few actions. And what will happen here is that because our database is an object with some extra properties and extra functions that it can do, it will also be able to do everything that the object can do. So when we define more methods, we will have all the object methods as well as the database methods we define. So this is called inheritance. And what we're doing here is we're getting our database class to inherit from this object. And that way, our database will contain all of those methods that the object has in Python. So that's just a quick overview as to what that is. So yeah. Anyway, our database class, which is the focus of this video. The database has a number of things that it needs in order to connect to a database. The first thing it needs is a URI, a Universal Resource Identifier. And this URI is going to be the MongoDB address. So, as you know, this is MongoDB //127.0.0.1 27017. Sorry about that. 27017, which is the port number. And we're also going to need a database. And now let me explain exactly what this is. Normally, we would be defining variables in the init method. And we would have self-URI equals something and self.database equals none. And what this would do, it would say database. I'm going to create a new object of type database, and this database object is going to have its own specific URI and its own specific database. So if we create two database objects, they could have different URIs and different databases. And I think that makes sense up to now, and if it doesn't, then you may want to watch a couple of videos before. But anyway, so these two database objects have these two different URIs and these two different databases. But really that's not what we want in this case. We don't want to have two different URIs. We want all of our connections to go to this URI. And we don't want two different databases. We in fact will always be using the same database for this project, which is the full stack database. We will also be using always the same collection or possibly two collections, which is the posts and the blogs collections. So we don't want self.database anywhere, because what that would do is it would say we need to create a database object, and this object will have its own URI and its own database. So instead what we want to say is database is a more overarching thing. It is not a real world object, but rather it is a blueprint. What I mean with this is, this URI would be the same for every database that we create if we wanted to create many. And this database would also be the same for every database we create if we wanted to create many. So I'm going to put a link under the video that will explain this in more depth, and that will help you understand, so that we don't, essentially I don't bore you talking about these sort of things. But just imagine that we had multiple objects of type database. The URI would be the same for all of them. That is what this static property is. It is a property that is shared among all objects of a class. So instead of them each having their own URI, they would all have the same URI. And that's what we would want, because we always want to be connecting to the same MongoD instance. We always want to be connecting to the local instance. So we have no use for any object-only properties, or also called instance properties. We don't want to be creating objects that have their own anything. All objects are only going to use this URI and this database. So really we don't need an init method at all, because we're not initializing any objects. We're not going to be initializing objects at all. Instead, what I'm going to create is an initialize method, and this is not a Python only thing, and I'm going to remove the self keyword from the beginning. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say client, which is my variable, is pymongo.mongoclient, and I'm going to have to import pymongo. And now in this bracket I want to put this URI here, but notice how it doesn't let me, because it says it is an unresolved reference. And that is because the only way to access this URI is through the database class. So if we say database.uri, now it knows that this URI lives in a database. So we can access things via self, and that is the object's value. So different URIs for each object would be accessed via self.uri. If we have a class URI, which is called the static property or static variable, then we need to access it through the database class. So at no point can we simply do URI unless the URI is defined inside the method. So database.uri, and that works. And something else we have to do is we have to tell Python that we're not going to be using self. And the way to do that is say at static method before the method itself. So what this does is it says, hey Python, we're not going to be using self in this method because this method is going to belong only to the database class as a whole and never to an instance of a database. And then we'll say database.database, which is this variable here, equals client full stack. And this is our full stack database that we created in MongoDB. And what that does is now database.database contains the database for this project. And we can access it from other parts of the program simply by saying database.database. So let's have a look at creating the insert method that we were looking at before. This insert method takes in a collection where are we going to write the data, and some data, which is what we're going to write. So once again, this insert method, the only thing it's going to do is it's going to say database.database and then collection.insert data. And the parameters it takes is collection and data. So what we're going to do here is we're going to give this insert method a collection, and what we're going to get is that collection first of all, and then we're going to insert data into that collection, and the data that we're going to insert is the thing that we pass the method. And once again, we need to make this method static as well. And now what we can do is copy this and paste it a couple of times and change it to find and find one. Find and find one. So what this does is it is going to find data. This is going to return a pymongo.cursor.cursor object, as we looked at in the first video where we looked at pymongo. And this find one method is not going to return a cursor actually, because if you remember, the cursor was used to start at the beginning of the collection and then go through each of the elements one by one. The find one method, what it does is it gets the first element that gets returned by the cursor and then gives that to us. So it doesn't return a cursor, it actually returns the JSON object that is stored in the database directly. So when we're finding one, we're not really finding data. What we're doing is we're performing a query. So I'm going to press Shift F6 and rename these things to query. And notice how these variables get renamed as well. And this is our database class now ready to be used. So if we go to our post and we import this, notice that it likes that and it thinks that is an acceptable thing to do. So now the collection variable, which is this one, and the data parameter, which is this one, now get passed into the insert method, which puts the data in the database. Just quickly going over what is happening again. We're defining a URI and a database as being class or static variables. This means that all database objects are indeed, the whole database class has these two variables stored in it. Any database objects that we create will also have these two values. Because we're never creating any database objects, we don't need to, because we've got the values that we need here. We can simply skip the init method entirely and not use self at all, and simply use static methods. The static methods can use these values by simply saying database.uri, and that gets this value. Database.database gets this value. Notice that we can also say database.uri from other classes as well if we wanted to. And then what we're doing in an initialize method is saying get me a client with database.uri, which is this one, and then get me the database that we're going to be using, which is the full stack database. Now that we're initialized, remember we will have to call this at the beginning of our program. When we're initialized, database.database will contain the database that we're using, the full stack database. So then we can say database, get me the collection and put some data in it. And the collection will be, in this case, posts, and the data will be self.json. In our app.py at the very beginning, we'll have to say database.initialize. We will have to import this. Now we will have to do this so that the database calls pymongo.mongo client and then gets the URI and initializes the database itself. So things are getting a bit more complicated now, but hopefully you're hanging in there. This object-oriented programming gets a bit difficult when we introduce these static properties here as well. If you're having a lot of difficulty and you have absolutely no idea what's going on, then go ahead and do ask questions, of course, but may I also recommend learning a bit more of the basics of computer science, possibly with the Computer Science for Absolute Beginners course that uses Java, but also introduces the same concepts. One thing to remember before we continue, however, is to make sure that these methods are not only performing the search, but also returning a value from it. If not, they will be performing the search and then returning none, which is the default, and we will never be able to find any data from these two methods. This method does not have to return anything because it simply puts something into the database and does not expect anything back. If you are confident that you know what's going on, or at least you kind of get it, then please do move on. Ask all the questions you need. That's why we've got the private group in Slack for it, and I'll be glad to help you out with it. And let's move on into the next video where we're going to be continuing our post object class, and then after that creating our blog. So I'll see you in the next one.